Say that again.
Welcome to the Union Church podcast.
Very nice. Thank you.
Welcome to the Afterword podcast from Union Church in Livingston County, Michigan. Each week we sit down to think out loud about how the gospel of Jesus Christ and the truths of his word connect to the questions, issues, and practices of everyday life. And today we're talking about 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13, and why we care about deacons. Hey everybody, welcome to the Afterword podcast. My name is Kyle, and I am here with my co-pastor and preacher extraordinaire, Ethan Ezikian.
Oh, I don't know if I agree with half of that statement. The preacher extraordinaire. Preacher. And man who tries to preach. Ethan Ezikian.
I'm always blessed by your preaching, brother, and I was this week.
Well, that's proof that the Holy Spirit is real, I think.
Amen.
How are you?
Oh, I'm great. It's been a great start to the summer, just to have the weather turn and start to get into some of our summer rhythms, getting to hang out outside. And
yeah. On Sunday morning, we were setting up at Three Fires Elementary School, and I just couldn't stop singing, "School's out for the summer."
The best start to the summer is getting to leave all of our church equipment set up at Three Fires. That is a blessing from the Lord.
Kyle, I have a very provocative question for you.
Oh, no.
I would love for you to name, you can just pick one of the many times where I have been right and you have been wrong.
Oh, no.
We could talk about, any number of theological issues. No, I'm just kidding, of course. But last week on the podcast, we quoted Finding Nemo.
Oh, yeah.
And I said circa 2003, and you said...
I said that's too early. It was later than that. And you were dead on.
I was dead on.
It was 2003 on the dot.
Yeah, so don't question me on Pixar launch dates, sir.
Never again.
Never again, yeah.
Never again.
If you've learned anything from this podcast, dear listener, Ethan knows his Disney movie.
Yeah, release dates are, man. Well, in all seriousness, Ethan, this past week we had a just jam-packed Sunday morning. We had one baptism, a couple dedications. We had a couple new members joining Union Church. Yep. It was what we call a Life Together Sunday. So we had a full room with most of our kids joining us for the service.
Lots of guests visiting.
So it was a full Sunday, and one of the things that happened on Sunday is you got to preach our final sermon in our series called Why Do We?
You say it like it happened on Sunday, like it was a traumatic event that everybody remembers.
Well,
what happened on Sunday?
No.
Well,
the reason I say that,
a sermon on deacons.
The reason I say that is because I think for most of the people visiting, it probably may have felt
traumatic,
a little bit
and jarring.
Not traumatic, but a little bit inside baseball.
Truthfully, that was a big concern of mine as I was preparing. It felt like something that needed to happen for the life of our church. We want to teach the word to those who call Union Church home, and particularly as we're establishing deacons at our church, we needed another Sunday to talk about the role of deacon and try to begin to address some of people's wrestling with how the elders have felt convicted about what this role should look like. But I also want Sunday mornings to be a place where on any Sunday morning, the people who come regularly have this gut feeling like that I could bring my unbelieving neighbor and I'm confident that they'll hear the gospel in a way that they can understand. And so those inside baseball Sundays sometimes I think are necessary, but also I just don't, I get a little uncomfortable with them at the same time,
Yeah. One of the things that I was grateful for with it is that it does illustrate something that you mentioned at the beginning of your sermon, which is that we want to be Bible people. And the gospel is certainly woven through every page of the Bible. And we want to read the Bible in a way in which everything is pointing to Christ. And yet there are passages of the Bible that are that do feel a little bit more niche, you might say, a little bit more inside baseball, particularly some of the ones we have talked about over the last few weeks that are really oriented around the way that Jesus Christ has structured his church in order for it to carry out the mission that he's tasked her with. So this matters. It matters because we want to be Bible people, and it matters because it's the way in which God has ordained his people to go about the mission of proclaiming the gospel in both word and deed. And so I was grateful to get to sit under your preaching, and I thought it was helpful in a lot of ways. And it was also a Life Together Sunday sermon about maybe a little over 30 minutes. It was not comprehensive either, and I know that there are likely some lingering questions for people, particularly about the office of deacon, who can be a deacon and what deacons will do.
Yeah, so we're going to spend the podcast talking about that stuff.
So yeah, we're going to spend the podcast talking about that stuff, and I think it might be a longer episode than normal. We're going to try
saddle up your horses.
Going to try and answer as many of what may be lingering questions for people as we possibly can. And so, Ethan, are you ready for the machine gun of questions today?
Ready? That's a relative term. I think so.
By the power of the Spirit.
Yeah.
All right, Ethan. Before we get into the questions themselves, do you want to read the passage from this Sunday, 1 Timothy 3?
Yes, I would love to. 1 Timothy 3, verses 8 through 13 reads, "Deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own household well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. One of the things that you really highlighted on Sunday was that the office of deacon in the church is a role that comes with a sort of spiritual authority and leadership. And that really was maybe the bedrock of how you talked about deacons on Sunday morning. So I want to start there today. What is the difference between how a deacon might be given authority in the life of the church and how an elder might be given authority in the life of the church? I think for most of the people, at least in our circles, in our congregation, when we think about the people who have been tasked with leading the church, we think of pastors and elders. And yet you made a pretty big deal about the deacons being given a sort of official capacity in leadership as well here. So what might be the difference between those elders and deacons and how we think about the authority God has given to them?
Yeah. So first, I think we can think about the information that the names give us. So we talked about elders in a sermon a few weeks ago. Here in 1 Timothy, Paul gives qualifications for elders, but in 1 Timothy 3, he uses the word overseer. And we've talked previously about how the word overseers, elders, and the verb shepherd get used together often. So that tells us a lot about the role of an elder. They oversee the church. You could say they lead or manage it. They're elders. They provide wisdom and guidance. They shepherd the flock, which means they lead, feed, protect, care for God's people. Deacon comes from the Greek word diakonos, which can simply be translated as servant or minister. And that means that deacons lead in serving. I think we can also look at Acts chapter 6, which is what we've referenced as the sort of founding story of deacons in the church. And to rehearse that story a little bit, it's the early church. The apostles are preaching and teaching. The early church is growing by a lot. The church is already caring for one another in really radical and tangible ways. People are selling everything they have and giving it to the poor. But in the daily distribution of care, the Hellenistic widows are being neglected. And so there's I think the King James says there's a murmuring that arises in the early church about this neglect that's happening. And in response, the apostles say to the church, choose 7 godly men from among you. And then the apostles lay hands on those men and commission them to lead the serving of the church. Historically, then, the role of deacon has been a role that has been oriented towards the physical sort of mercy ministries of the church. And that's how we see the differentiation between the two roles. Like the apostles in Acts 6, we've said this before, we don't have apostles anymore. They were specific people for a specific time in church history. But in Acts 6, they were the ones who were assigned the roles of the prayer and the ministry of the word. And we see a corresponding responsibility given to elders. They're in Titus chapter 1, they're the ones who are described as being able to handle the word of God and teach it well. That's also a requirement listed in Timothy. They're the ones who set the doctrine of the church and guard the doctrine of the church.
Practically, maybe one place you would see this, I think the only place where we see elders or even the apostles in a plural manner making a decision for the sake of the church is in Acts 15, which is regarding a sort of spiritual truth. Do Gentiles need to be circumcised in this new covenant life of the church? And the apostles and the elders of the Jerusalem church get together to make a decision that will impact the church, not just in Jerusalem, but across the Roman Empire. So that's that kind of, that's in that realm of spiritual authority. What does the truth of the gospel and the Bible, how does that impact how we faithfully live? What is contrary to the word of God? What is in line with the word of God? Though that's the realm that you're talking about in terms of the authority of elders.
And every Christian is called to believe the right things about God. And yet God has given the role of elders to guard and set the doctrine of the church. Similarly, every Christian is called to care for the vulnerable and the poor. And yet we think that God has given the role of deacon to maybe lead and guard the culture of the church around these things. That's what we think we see. That's the precedent we see being set in Acts chapter 6. And I think that we're seeing the qualifications for that kind of role being laid out in 1 Timothy chapter 3.
So one of the big elements of the sermon, one of the big questions that you wanted to address was the theological position that we have come to as elders and that we're going to be undertaking as we enact deacons at our church, which is that the office of deacon is reserved for qualified men. And a big part of that reasoning is this seeing this office as having a spiritual authority and weight to it that makes it appropriate and right, fitting with the overarching biblical descriptions of men and women's roles particularly in the home and in the church, as designed as complementary. Men being given the responsibility to lead as the head in a marriage, and women being given the responsibility to submit to their husband in a marriage. But in a church, we see that responsibility played out with particularly in the realm of the offices of the church, the authority that's given to qualified men to lead the church. Now, in saying all of that, I think that comes with quite a lot of questions for people who may be coming from a different sort of both a church background and seeing female deacons played out in other church backgrounds, but also just in a culture that has a lot more minimizing of the differences between men and women, there's going to be instincts in us that just rub a little bit the wrong way in hearing that. Even for men and women in our church who would totally be with you on, the office of pastor and elders reserved for men, but maybe have a little bit more resistance to the office of deacon being reserved for men.
Right.
So can we just get into some of the nitty gritty questions then that arise from that, and how women can or cannot be installed into this office?
Yeah, I think we should. Okay.
So thinking about the authority that's given to deacons, somebody might say, okay, this argument certainly has been utilized for the case for women deacons. Someone might say, you just said yourself that the words that we use for elder and deacon give us an indication of how we should think about them. Elders are overseers.
Right.
They are overseeing the church, but deacons are servants. That doesn't seem to come with authority. That seems to be a sort of humbling sort of role that doesn't seem like it's coming with the kind of authority that you're claiming that would leave it reserved for men who are qualified. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would first acknowledge that there are many complementarians who joyfully embrace the different callings for men and women and different roles in the home and in the church. People who we would generally see as great allies and pastors and churches who we deeply respect, who do see that the role of deacon as strictly a service-oriented role. And therefore, they can be complementarians and say strongly that the role of elder is reserved for qualified men, but have a category for a deacon who could be a woman. Mm-hmm. I said that in the sermon. I think it's important to acknowledge here. Pastors who I would be afraid to, like John Piper. John Piper seems to say that it's allowable for women to serve as deacons. But as we've gotten into the text, I just simply can't. I don't agree with the exegesis that's happening. We said some of this in the sermon, and I'll repeat some of it here. A lot of it has to do with 1 Timothy 3:11, where the ESV says, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Some understand the Greek word is I'm gonna not remember it perfectly, something like gynekos, and it can be translated as wives, but it also can be equally legitimately translated as women. The word "their" in the ESV translation, "their wives," is actually an interpretive choice on the part of the translators, and so the literal translation into English could say wives likewise or women likewise. And so from that, people like John Piper and others kind of take this verse to be saying that there is a possibility that there could be women deacons. And they're also looking at Romans 16:1, where Paul commends Phoebe, a servant of the church in Centre. That word servant is diakonos. You could translate it a deacon of the church in Centre. And so the question is she a just generic servant, or is she a deacon? And I'll just keep using John Piper as my foil. John Piper and others will say, well, she seems like she's a deacon. One thing that I didn't mention in the sermon is the broader context of 1 Timothy chapter 3. One of the reasons I think that Paul is talking about not just a servant role, but a servant leadership role is because he's talking about how to conduct oneself in the household of God. If you look in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, this is immediately after the qualifications for deacons. Paul says, I hope to come to you soon, But I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God. So he's writing these things. What are these things? Well, he's just finished discussing qualifications for deacons, and before that, elders. But where Paul begins to talk about how people should behave in the church actually starts back in chapter 2, at least in verse 8, where he says, I desire then that in every place men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger, quarreling. Likewise, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Let a woman... God bless you, sir. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. That's what's happening immediately before Paul starts to talk about qualifications for elders. And I read all of that to point out, like, as Paul begins to talk about how people should conduct themselves in the church, there's a lot there that we don't have time to unpack right now. But it's immediately gendered conversation. And in 1 Timothy 3, I don't think, like, the thrust of the context leads me to believe he's not talking about servant roles. He's talking about those who are responsible for shepherding, or that's not a precise enough word. Those who are responsible for stewarding specific things in the life of the church. Qualifications for elders, qualifications for deacons. And I feel like I've talked for long enough that I've kind of talked myself into a bit of a cul-de-sac, so help me get out of it.
Well, one other thing I would add to that is that in the New Testament in particular, the language of servant and the language of leadership is not they're not diametrically opposed. They're not incompatible with each other. Yeah. You think back to Jesus's words to the apostles, whoever would be last must be first. Whoever would lead would be a servant. That Jesus gives his apostles this paradigm that leadership does look like serving. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think we may have talked about this last week looking at Acts 6, but it's not a coincidence then that when you get to Acts 6 and you get this institution of these men who are called to lead the church, that same word for serve is used both to talk about serving the tangible needs of the church and even for the apostles in serving the word to the people. That is one thing I would just add to that, is that when we talk about the language of serving, there's the paradigm in the New Testament is not you have leaders and then you have servers. The paradigm in the New Testament is that leaders must be servers, and whether they are deacons or pastors or elders. It's not that one is leading and one is serving. It's that they are leading through their service in different realms, right? So that would be just one thing I would add to give a little shape to that too.
Yeah. Plus, I think we keep going back to Acts 6, and it is really significant that the apostles lay their hands on the 7 who are chosen. That's not like, hey, I'm going to pray for you and now go be on your way. It's a deliberate delegation of authority.
Yeah.
So I don't. It's going to be really hard to convince me that these are just raw generic servants. Mm-hmm. I believe that. So Paul's recognizing them as somebody who as a group that has authority. They have authority, or they have responsibility, and it's indicated in 1 Timothy because there's qualifications for it.
Right. Like you just said, everybody should be serving the poor in the church. You don't have to have these qualifications in order to serve the needy in your congregation.
Yeah, but leaders in God's church are called to a specific set of standards, mostly tied to one's character.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so if I'm not even an egalitarian, just a complementarian who's trying to wrestle with this. I see complementarian churches on both sides of having women deacons, and I hear you say that. Then I'm thinking, okay, I hear you, but then in verse 11, we do get this. There's a reference to women having qualifications. So one of the things you laid out in your sermon was that it seems implausible, and I'm with you on this. It seems very implausible that Paul is talking about a subgroup of deacons here. Like he's been talking about all deacons, and now he's specifically talking about women deacons. That doesn't seem to make sense logically, the way that the language is used here. But what is he talking about then? How do we understand the women who he references here that do need to have these qualifications of being dignified, not being double-tongued? How should we think about this?
Well, I think, first of all, one thing I didn't say in the sermon is verse 12, which comes right after verse 11, where he says, "Why their wives likewise, or women likewise, must be dignified." He says, "Let deacons each be the husband of one wife." Mm-hmm. And to me, that's one more clue. If Paul was talking about a subgroup of deacons who were the female ones, it seems like he would need to then say, "But let the male deacons be the husband of one wife."
Yeah, sure. Or let the men be husbands of one wife.
Yeah, he says, okay, if he says the women likewise must be, then maybe he should just say the men then must be husbands of one wife. But he returns to the word deacons as if he has departed from the subject of deacons for a moment. We talked in the sermon about how the word likewise seems to be indicating like a different and separate group of people. Just like in verse 8, he says deacons likewise. Deacons are not a subgroup of elders who he's just been talking about. They're a different group of people. I think also one thing we didn't say in the sermon is that one thing that Paul is doing is acknowledging that the work of service and care that happens in the mercy ministries of the church is probably helped by a feminine touch. And whether they are women or wives, it's probably, maybe Paul is acknowledging that women will need to be involved in the care and mercy ministries of the church. And this is what we've got a question later in our plan talking about church history. But just to nod toward it a little bit, you look at church history and there is a strong history of female diaconal assistants or unordained deaconesses. We can talk about that more, but they're different than ordained deacons. Mm-hmm. So church history seems to attest to that reality.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into the history more later. It is complicated, but I think one thing we could say really strongly is that both the passage and I would argue for church history as well, point to the necessity of women involvement in the diaconal work.
Yeah.
And even as complementarians who land on this issue as saying that the office is reserved for men, we would affirm that wholeheartedly and say that, like, one of the things we've talked about as elders, I don't know how much inside baseball we want to get into here, but like one of the things we've talked about as elders as we both studied the word and tried to put together a plan of how will deacons function at Union Church, one of the things we've said several times in our meetings, and I think even in the job description that we sent out to the congregation when we introduced this topic, was that it's going to be imperative that these deacons at Union are leading teams that include both men and women, or in some way are equipping both men and women to be involved in like deeply participating in the diaconal work itself.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is this verse. The fact that he includes wives or women here, it indicates that they are going to be participating in the work.
Yeah.
even if they're not the same people who he's referring to as deacons.
Yeah.
Now, let's. I do want to talk about the history in just a minute, but I want to circle back here though and press you. You gave a couple options of who Paul could be talking about here. You said that he could be talking about the wives of deacon. He could be talking about female diaconal assistants, or deaconesses, as they have sometimes been called throughout church history. Where do you actually land? Who do you think Paul is talking about?
I think that Paul is talking about women who assist the deacons. I'm not sure that he's specifically addressing female diaconal assistants who assist the deacons in the work of ministry. I think it could be, I think about practically, if I'm as an elder, involved in a care case in our church, there's a time and a place where I would rely on the input and wisdom of my own wife. But then there's also a time and a place where I would look to another godly woman in the church to walk alongside a care case with me. And I don't think the text is limiting me to think about this in one subcategory or the other. So humbly speaking, if I was going to interpret the text, like translated into English, I would say women likewise, but I would still not understand that to be female deacons. What would you say?
I would probably lean toward the way that ESV has translated it, as wives.
That's probably the best, because they're way smarter than us. Sometimes I do think when a pastor gets up and was like, well, this isn't what the Greek really means, it's like there's a whole committee of people who speak Greek in circles around you who made this decision. So don't be such a proud person,
Well, there are other translations that do translate it just as women. Like the NASB is one that I really trust. They do a great job translating very literally. They translate it as women. The interpretation, like the interpretive decision here, it really has to do for me with the flow of the passage. Again, going from this initial qualification list for deacons, then the way I'm reading Paul is it's almost like, and their wives also should be X, Y, or Z. And the deacon should be a husband of one wife. So it flowing right into the deacon's responsibilities to his family is one of the links there for me. And I do think that the nature of diaconal work would mean that a deacon was going to be more directly involved in the lives of women in a way that the early apostles and elders probably weren't, particularly in that culture. Yeah. So it makes sense to me. But I think either could be the case here. And again, I think it points to the fact that women were necessarily going to be participating in some form or fashion in the diaconal work. So
yeah, and practically as it relates to how we will then implement deacons at the church, we are saying biblically qualified men who are deacons are commissioned to galvanize all kinds of women in our church for the roles for like serving, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of practically we're interpreting it like women.
Yeah, that's true.
Not necessarily deacons' wives.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back. You mentioned two things that I want to ask about. One is you mentioned Acts chapter 6 several times. And that kind of helping set the paradigm for this. Somebody who was maybe more skeptical may come and say, well, Acts chapter 6, we talked about this a little bit last week. Acts chapter 6 doesn't call these men deacons.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in Romans chapter 16, Paul uses the word deacon, the Greek word diakonos, to describe Phoebe. So on one hand, you've got Acts chapter 6, which doesn't use the noun deacon to describe these men. And then in Romans 16, you do have the word diakonos used to describe Phoebe. Why would we take Acts chapter 6 as prescriptive in how we think about deacons, but not Romans chapter 16.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is we're not taking Acts chapter 6 as prescriptive per se. So we do make distinctions between passages in the Bible that are describing what's happening versus prescribing. So some passages in the Bible are descriptive, not prescriptive, right? Both Acts chapter 6 and Romans 16 are, well, Romans 16 isn't necessarily, it's descriptive. We'll say it's descriptive. And so is Acts chapter 6. The question then becomes, well, like, how do we see these things that are being described and let them influence how we interpret passages that are clear commands or like imperatives like we have here in 1 Timothy chapter 3.
Sure.
So 1 Timothy 3, qualifications for deacons, that's prescribing something for the household of God everywhere, like Paul said later in that chapter, right? So in Acts chapter 6, we don't have the noun deacon being used, but we have versions of the word diakonos being used 3 different times in the text to describe the work of serving and ministering that's going on in the church. And I think it would be fair to say that we're taking what happens in this unique situation in the early church and using it as a paradigm that influences how we think about deacons. What's happening in Romans chapter 16 is that Paul is simply using the noun diakonos to describe a person, Phoebe, and he says she's a patron to many. I believe is one way you could describe it. Let me just look it up real quick. Romans 16 verse 1 says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant, that's the word that could be deacon, a servant of the diakonos of the church at Centre. And verse 2 says, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. He's saying she has been very helpful. Patron denotes like, she's been a financial supporter in some way. Some people have postulated that maybe she was the one who brought the letter to the Roman church. It's obvious that Phoebe's worthy of honor for her service. That's why Paul is honoring her in the text. But we looked at on Sunday the many places in the New Testament where the noun diakonos does not denote the office deacon. So Paul calls himself a servant, a diakonos. He's an apostle. He's not a deacon. Paul calls Apollos a diakonos in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Apollos is a teacher in the church. He's not a deacon. He tells Timothy, you'll be a good diakonos to the church if you do these things in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Timothy is a missionary and a leader and a pastor to the church in Ephesus. He's not a deacon. Paul even talks about civil magistrates as diakonos in Romans 13. They have no role in the church. So the word diakonos overwhelmingly in the New Testament has this generic meaning of servant or minister. And what we're saying about Romans 16 is it doesn't force you to conclude that she would have the office of deacon. It's not listed in the list of qualifications that deacons would have the responsibility of bearing letters from apostles to the church. And that's all that Romans 16, or being a patron. And that's all that Romans 16 says Phoebe does, which is not insignificant. She's doing great work in the kingdom of God. But it's not work that is explicitly connected to the work of deacon. So based on what Romans 16 is giving us, it does not force us to conclude that she is a deacon with a capital D officially ordained in the church.
I think it again goes back to some of that distinction we're trying to make between the necessity of women being involved in this diaconal work and whether or not the role as described by Paul in 1 Timothy and at least prefigured by the ordination of these 7 men in Acts 6 is this sort of official authority and responsibility.
Yeah, the kind of work in Acts 6 is the kind of work that deacons are called to do.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the case. Not necessarily the case in Romans 16.
Well, and it's almost certain that as the early church developed, the titles of elder and deacon were things that developed as the church needed them. And so it's not surprising that you wouldn't get any explicit use of or description of the office of deacon until Paul's later letters.
And First Timothy is happening near the end of Paul's ministry.
Whereas describing what the apostles do in Acts chapter 6 is happening very early in the life of the church. It's not surprising they wouldn't use the term deacon to describe those men at that time.
Probably months after Pentecost.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. Now, we did talk briefly about the church history piece.
Yeah, we should talk about that more.
You didn't mention this really at all in your sermon on Sunday.
Because I totally disregard history, and I just say, I don't have any creed but the Bible. No, that's not true at all. We talk a lot about church history, and I'd love to kind of turn the tables and ask you, because you've looked at this a little more. I didn't mention church history in this sermon, not because I don't respect it, but because I was simply trying to be really conscious of time and couldn't say everything that I wanted to say. But I remember reading an article in favor of female deacons written by another Acts 29 pastor. And he argued that throughout church history, there have been female deacons. And he cited people like, I remember Spurgeon in particular being in favor of female deacons. And so I was like, oh, okay, case closed. But then as we looked at church history, we kind of got a different picture that emerged. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I just want to say history is a complicated thing. So it's hard to make sweeping judgments about church history. I mean, we as elders, we've done a lot of this recently when we talked about baptism last year and whether or not infant baptism was present early on in the life of the church, or whether cradle baptism was the common pattern. It's hard to look back 1,800 years and get a lot of specifics.
Yeah.
So this is complicated, it's complex, but for us, it doesn't matter. And that's one thing I would want to say off the top is that we're starting with the Bible because this is the Word of God. This is the Lord prescribing to His church how she should be structured in order to go about the mission that God has given to us. But church history helps give us an indication of how the church has taken those instructions
and interpreted the Bible.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is really important for us is, as Christians, especially in Christians in the 21st century, where we have so much information available to us that we kind of always put ourselves in the position of judge. Like if I'm going to take care of my health, I might have a traditional doctor that says this, and I might see this influencer on Instagram that says this, and I might find this study that says this, and I ultimately have to take all of these things and decide what is true and right for me, right?
Yeah.
And we do that with politics, we do that with health, we do that with raising our kids. It's just like the default position we're in. But Christianity is inherently a faith that has been passed down. And that's how Paul talks about it when he talks to Timothy about raising up faithful men who could teach and pass on doctrine. We read about that in Titus when we talked about elders a couple weeks ago. So we want to take seriously the ways that the church has passed down the faith, where there needs to be reform and there has been missteps. We want to own those things, but we want to take seriously how the church has thought about these things. So when you look at the history of the church, the overwhelming position throughout the history of the church has been a male-only diaconate. Now, that's not to say that there's never been any churches that have had female deacons, but the picture of that is very cloudy because in the ancient church, the word that is often used to describe female deacons is deaconess. And oftentimes when modern commentators go and read some of these church fathers about what's going on in the early church, you see this word deaconess and you assume, oh, so they had male and female deacons. Yeah,
just in the same way that we would say, well, there's waiters and waitresses, and you could even call a waitress a waiter nowadays. And it would be because they're one and the same.
They wouldn't have like a necessarily different role.
We're bringing those sensibilities onto historical texts.
Yeah. So you have to be really careful when you go back and you read some of the early church fathers and not assume that when they say deaconess, they mean what a 21st century Christian may think when they hear deaconess.
Yeah.
One of the ways you can see this, for example, is like in the I think it's the Council of Nicaea in 325, one of the very first worldwide church councils. They actually address the concept of deaconesses, and in the Council of Nicaea, I think this is Canon 19. I'm gonna see where I pulled it up. They talk about how the thing that they're really trying to talk about in this council is whether or not you should accept the baptism of pastors who had then fallen away under persecution.
So different theological issue.
But one of the things that they say in this is they talk about they specifically talk about deaconesses, and the council says when we say deaconess, we mean those who have assumed the habit. So think about Catholic Church, and you think about someone who has taken on a vow of a life dedicated to ministry, who might wear a habit, right?
Yeah, a nun.
Think about a nun, right? And this is common all throughout the church history, particularly in the Catholic branches of the church nowadays. But early on, it was very common for women to take a vow of chastity, to never be married, to
give themselves to serving,
give them their lives to service. And what's interesting about this Council of Nicaea, what they go on to say is they say, who, talking about deaconesses, since they have no imposition of hands, that's an ordination, right? The hands have not been laid on them. They have not had the hands laid on him. They say are to be numbered only among the laity. So these are women who are not in this early church. You start to have these distinctions being made between clergy and laity. So clergy, roles that were specifically described in the Bible, ordained by Jesus to lead the church. They would talk about presbyters or elders, deacons. Now they would also talk about bishops, and then a few hundred years later, talk about popes. But they would see a difference between those ordained roles and the laity that may give all of their lives for service and may take on specific roles in the church, but are not ordained with this sort of spiritual authority.
Yeah.
So you can see that hinted at right here in the Council of Nicaea, a worldwide council of bishops and elders in the church at this time. Yeah. This is how they were talking about it. About 100 years later, you get there's a commentary on 1 Timothy that is written. It's attributed to a man called Ambrosiaster, who historians aren't even sure exactly who this person was, other than he was a member of the clergy. He was a pastor somewhere.
That's a cool name.
Ambrosiaster. Yeah. Add that one to your list.
Ambrosiaster.
This is someone who is cited by Augustine, for example. His commentary is cited by Augustine in the 400s. And he specifically says on this verse, he says, he says Paul is not referring to women deacons, since those are not allowed in the church.
Okay.
He says it is heretics who have such persons. So there are, again, don't want to paint with too broad a brush and say that nobody has ever made the case for women deacons throughout history. But one of the things that's complicated about it is, I think the vast majority of the time when people see evidence for women deacons in church history, it's referred to in this language of deaconesses, which were generally seen in the church as women who were serving as sort of diaconal assistants. This sort of blended into the trend to have monasteries and not monasteries, but what's the nun version of a monastery?
Nunneries?
No, it's not a nun. I can't think of. Somebody will write it.
Convents.
Yeah. Like this blended into the tradition to have nuns who give up all of their lives to serve in that way. You get people like Mother Teresa, right? It's all kind of in this same realm of women who gave their lives to serve the poor, in particular, the material needs of the church. Sometimes would function in serving to assist in something like baptism, when women would be baptized. Would serve,
because in the early church they got baptized naked.
Yes, yeah. I'm glad we don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
So the trend in modern day Christianity, particularly in modern day Protestantism, to say we can have female deacons and they're the exact same thing as male deacons ordained to the same office. That is pretty new.
Yeah. I mean, even so often, and it's hard not to do this, we don't have time to do all the research and think all the thoughts ourselves. And so we'll say, well, so-and-so believes this and I trust their teaching. And so I'm going to adopt that view. Like somebody like Tim Keller, you could say he's advocated for deaconesses in the church. But when you do the research inside of the polity of the PCA, which is the denomination that Keller was a part of, deaconesses are not ordained deacons. They're a different role. And that's what Keller argued for, at least within the scope of his ministry at Redeemer Presbyterian in New York.
And there's a lot of conversation that can be had about, okay, well, how do we then think about the role of women in this diaconal work if they are vital to it? And that's one of the ways that it has happened. In the Catholic Church, you still have that role of deaconess. Interestingly, the Catholic Church actually just has gone through this same thing, and people have brought up, hey, we should think about having female deacons. And the Catholic Church just the Pope essentially came after this. They had a whole committee researching this, and they came down and said, we don't need to make any changes at this time. So,
which is kind of instructive. Like, we're not going to take our cues from the Catholic Church's interpretation of Scripture, but like another body in basically a totally different context, but still with all of the modern pressure, like egalitarian pressures, has looked at how to interpret this passage and church history and decided, no, we're not going to change amidst all the pressure to change.
Yeah. And that's not, like you said, that's not necessarily instructive for us, but one other thing I would point to throughout church history that I think is helpful. This is just an anecdote really, but when during the Reformation, when the churches had begun to branch off of the Catholic Church, and Calvin is establishing the church in Geneva, the Protestant church, Calvin was very frustrated because the church had grown to a position where they left the care of the poor in their cities. And you have to remember, at this point, it's Christendom. So everybody in Geneva was a Christian, right? Everybody in Geneva, where Calvin pastored at, went to his church. Like, there was no...
Yeah, people, if you said, when did you become a Christian? They'd look at you weird because they'd say, well, I was born in Geneva. I'm a Christian.
Right. So that doesn't mean they were all necessarily regenerate, but they all considered themselves a part of the church, right? And so Calvin was frustrated because they had gotten to a point where they assumed that care for the poor in Geneva was a responsibility of the government, of the magistrate. And
kind of sounds like America.
And Calvin was frustrated because he said, look at these men in Acts 6. Look at this office of deacon. This is a role of spiritual weight and authority, and we are passing it off to the civil magistrate. And Calvin said, we are derelict in our duty as the church. This is a responsibility that has spiritual weight to it that God has given to the church. Now, when you get to a more pluralistic society and you do have a civil magistrate, that we want to say, on one hand, I'm glad that the government cares about taking care of the poor, but we can't allow that to it's a common grace. It is a common grace, exactly. But we can't allow that to dissuade us as the church from taking care of the poor within our midst, and in at least in a slightly different arena, taking care of the poor around us. And the deacons are meant to give us that. Now, the reason I bring that up is because Calvin thought it was important for women to be involved in the diaconal work. Yeah. But he distinguished then in Geneva going forward about the different ways that diaconal work went forth. And again, thinking about that role having such spiritual weight and authority, he continued in the same kind of historical tradition to see it more in line with a pastoral or elder type of authority and weight. Not the same, but in a similar kind of category. Maybe even, again, going back to using that language of clerical, of clergy, that the Lord gives authority and responsibility to this office. So those are some of the historical trends that we would point to as being at least instructive to how the church has thought about this throughout the centuries.
Yeah. So all that being said, Kyle, would you ever change your mind on this issue?
That's a great question. I'm the kind of person that I like to get to a point where I'm so convinced of myself that I can't see myself changing my mind. So I don't want to I don't see this issue as one where I'm like, it's 50-50 and I just got to pick one.
Yeah.
At the same time, you mentioned it at the beginning of this podcast. This is not an area. I do recognize that there is a faithful way of interpreting the Bible where you could come out on the other side of this.
Yeah.
Even though I don't think it's true. I don't think it's what the Bible's communicating.
Yeah.
And so I want to be charitable with the men and women in churches that have faithfully come to the point of allowing and encouraging female deacons, especially when they are men and women in churches who we do think about complementarianism and men and women, and particularly the role of pastors and elders and how that functions in the life of the church in the same way that I do. I'm not going to accuse John Piper of just succumbing to egalitarianism and the way that our culture thinks about gender. You know what I mean? Is there anything in how we think about that sort of charity? Is there anything else in that realm that we need to make sure that our congregation knows before we move on?
Well, I mean, I'm in the same boat as you. This is sort of it's not so much would I change my mind, but where does this fall in theological triage, like we've talked about in the past? So I'm pretty fully convinced in terms of the exegesis of the scriptures and looking at church history secondarily, pretty fully convinced that the role of ordained deacon is reserved for qualified men. And I actually feel like, I don't know, I'm so convinced that I would be ready to debate John Piper about it. I watched a video he did about interpreting 1 Timothy 3, and I just thought, John, you left the gloves on. You should take the gloves off and really pummel this text. I just felt like he was not, I wasn't on the same page as him. So I'm pretty convinced, and yet it's not so the theological triage question though tells me this is not a first tier issue where if you don't believe it, you're not a Christian. Is the second tier issues are things that maybe differentiate what church you're going to be a part of. And if it's on me to decide for a church, if it's my spiritual responsibility as an elder to lead a church a particular way, I'm going to decide for male deacons. But if I'm becoming a member,
your responsibility as an elder or pastor.
Yeah. But if I'm becoming a member at a church that has female deacons but is otherwise complementarian, I could probably pretty happily be a member there. It won't offend my conscience too much. And a lot of that is because a complementarian church that allows for female deacons is just seeing the role as fundamentally different than how I see the role.
And we have seen and been a part of churches that do that. So in those kind of contexts, often what you'll see is it's less seen as an office with a heavy weight of spiritual authority, and more seen as what we might just call a staff role, a ministry leader role, even a volunteer role.
Yeah.
And they would use that biblical language of deacon to talk about a wide variety of people serving in the church.
So I wouldn't, this particular issue would not keep me from becoming a member at another church. Even if somehow I was called to be a pastor at another church that already had a system set up and they viewed deacons in a particular way. This definitely wouldn't, it would be like the 50th thing on my list of things I wanted to address as a pastor of the church. It would not be a high priority for me. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think it might be helpful to just hear how we think. The hard thing is we've taken other issues when we've talked about theological triage, like baptism.
Yeah.
And we've said, okay, people who have different perspectives can exist in the same church.
Mm-hmm.
And we've put that into practice at Union. You can't really do that with questions about biblical roles and complementarianism versus egalitarian positions, or complementarian male deacons only and complementarian female deacons allowable people. You can't really do that because the leadership of the church practically just has to decide what you're going to do, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's if we can't say, well, we're going to do both, because if we do both, what that means is we are allowing female deacons. It means we are functionally, that's what we're doing. And we've actually, I mean, you can see this, some of the denominations that you and I have worked in previously, we've seen this where a denomination might take the stance of, we're going to let every church, not about deacons necessarily, but we're going to let every church decide whether they're going to be complementarian or egalitarian in who can be an elder or pastor. And what you see happen really quickly is what happens is that denomination is functionally egalitarian.
Yeah. And if that were
there are women pastors within the denomination.
Yeah. And if that were to happen at Union just around this issue of deacons, it would just mean that those who are convicted about male only deacons would have to just smother their convictions. They wouldn't be allowed to exist in the life of our church. Those convictions. I mean, you could have those convictions and just like never act upon them, I suppose. But like we have to choose a particular way to govern the church.
Yeah, to be.
And the leaders of the church are united, like truly united. Nobody's just like choosing not to talk about this. We've studied this together prayerfully. The elders who are called to guard the doctrine of our church have come to a united decision.
And I would say united on both fronts that we've just been talking about here. On one front, united that, this is what's right for Union as we try to faithfully interpret the scriptures, and united in that this is not a first tier issue, and that we want to treat with charitably both the other churches and congregations that we love who come to a different conclusion, but also the people in our midst who may disagree with us. And we know that there are people, even on our elder team, we all came from a variety of backgrounds.
Yeah, I went into this process expecting to come out in favor of female deacons.
So we, as an elder team, are also committed to treating with charity the congregants in our midst who do not see the same thing that we see, and yet want to lovingly and faithfully coexist in our church.
Yeah.
In a united manner.
Yeah. And I think we also, this might be a good place to just reinforce that we are also united as a leadership team, that we, even though we're making these decisions about biblically qualified men taking on the roles of elder and deacon, that does not mean we are content to be a male only echo chamber as the leaders of the church. And it also it means we're not content to even give the impression that we want to be a male only echo chamber. We want to be eager to listen to all those who we shepherd who are not elders and deacons. And we want to give the impression, the vibe, that's what gospel culture is. It's the perception and vibe and feel of a church. And there are some complementarian churches that I think wrongly have the right theology but give the wrong impression and make women feel like they are second-class citizens or less valued in some way. Mm-hmm. And we want the opposite of that. We want to really honor and value women in every way, as what you might call pretty strict complementarians. Mm-hmm. So,
and and the reality is that in a culture that often says, to honor someone means you need to give them a position of leadership, there are going to there's just always going to be ways that a complementarian church butts up against some of our cultural expectations and assumptions that are woven into how we see the world living in the 21st century. But our aim is to do everything that we can.
So far as it depends on us.
It depends on us to give that impression. Okay, so Ethan, let's talk. Let's do some more, just a couple rapid fire things then on that. How does this work out practically if this is what we're trying to do? There's one kind of big category is, okay, well then, what can a woman do to serve in the church? And maybe just even, I don't know. We'll just leave it at that. What if a woman can't serve as an elder or a deacon? If she can't have that role of spiritual responsibility and authority within the life of the church, where does God equip and call women to serve in the life of Union Church?
My goodness, there's not a way to be precise enough about this. We have to kind of talk in generalities, but women, I would say generally women who have the gift of, teaching should teach in appropriate spheres in the church. Appropriate spheres being, like Bible studies, mixed gendered classes on areas of expertise. We kind of see this in teaching in particular. There's a sort of spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there's setting and guarding the doctrine of the church. That's reserved for the elders of the church. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's, I don't know what you would call it, just like subject matter expert teaching or something like that.
Maybe just put it into a practical example. I remember one of our former members led a class on parenting that we did over the weekend one day several years ago. She was a woman. She had a lot of expertise in counseling and family counseling in particular. And the thing I think the way that it was framed that made this really clear is that what we're talking about in a class on parenting is not laying down the authoritative doctrine of the church. We're talking about what are some wise principles in how we execute the principle, the doctrine that we see in the church, that parents are called to love their children, that fathers shouldn't exasperate their children, that children should honor their parents. How do we work that out then in wise ways in our modern context? And that's where we could tap someone who has that expertise and say, hey, give us some things to think about.
Yeah, we could have a woman on this podcast to help us think through a text. One thing that might be helpful is just to lay out clearly, like, we actually understand preaching to be a very different thing than just giving a talk. So when you and I or other elders stand up to preach on a Sunday morning, we see that as a particular pastoral act of setting, guarding, teaching. It's what Paul tells Titus that elders have to do in Titus chapter 1. He says, he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also rebuke those who contradict it. That's different than giving a TED talk somewhere else, or even different than leading or facilitating a Bible study or talking to the youth group or talking to the whole church about something outside of preaching on a Sunday morning. So what we can say firmly is at our church, the role of preaching on a Sunday morning is going to be reserved for biblically qualified men who serve as elders. And there's some more nuance there, but generally that's we'll just leave it there for now. And then there's this sort of spectrum that we've been talking about, where we would need to apply wisdom in all other spheres.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
The closer we get to the authoritative laying down of doctrine that we see in preaching, the closer we get to that on that side of the spectrum, the more careful that we are going to be as elders about passing that on to anybody who is not an elder in the church.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's hard about this is we're trying to balance like a couple different things. One, we're trying to balance the unique role of elders and pastors to do that. And the other is we're trying to balance the gendered aspect of it that we see in Scripture, particularly in somewhere like 1 Timothy 2, where Paul is explicitly talking about men and women and how they function in terms of the teaching one another. And so we are not the kind of church that's going to say no women can ever get up in front of a mixed crowd or in front of a group of men and give some sort of instruction.
Right.
But we do still want to take that gender dynamic seriously. And so that's why this spectrum thing is important to us to say. The hard and fast rules are for us. We're really talking about preaching on a Sunday morning is like the one that we know. That's one that we're giving to the pastors and elders and limiting it to that. Beyond that, we're going to have to apply a lot of wisdom.
Yeah. And we've been talking about deacons this whole time, and all of a sudden we just switch back to talking about more elder-like things. Yeah. But we should just say also, so leadership, administration, coordination, influence, those types of things are not like women are not held back from those things at the church. Here's some practical examples. Like we have Emma Baker, who leads our Union Kids ministry. That's not just like a throwaway word. She actually leads the volunteers. And if we need to make a decision about children's discipleship at Union Church, it's not just happening in the elder room. Like very few like ministry decisions are made in the elder room. Primarily elders are talking about, care and praying for the church and those sorts of things.
Maybe some very broad, big church.
Right.
Church
but
things.
we're not going to the elders and saying, hey, this is how the curriculum we need to choose for third grade on a Sunday morning or something like that. So there's leadership there as she leads the team. She's influencing the decisions that we make. The difference is that so Emma's exercising leadership and influence and discernment and administration. If, God forbid, something went wrong and we taught poorly in Union Kids, the elders are ultimately responsible before God for that.
Bearing the responsibility. Yeah.
That's the difference that we see.
Yeah.
And that's the primary distinction of complementarianism, in my opinion. Similarly, with the deacons, we're kind of talking in hypotheticals because we have not built out as robust of a mercy ministry inside or outside the church as we have a sort of teaching ministry. Mm-hmm. But as we build up mercy ministries, women will oversee, manage, administrate, influence decisions. But who will bear the responsibility if those go wrong before the Lord? Yep. That's the main question.
Mm-hmm. And the answer to that being just saying it explicitly,
biblically qualified men who are deacons
had hands laid upon them to give them that, to delegate them that responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that defines then, or leads us to then, Ethan, what will deacons actually do at Union Church? There may still be some questions of like, okay, you use the term mercy ministry, but in some of our conversations about that, we've also talked about, hey, how could deacons help us with setup and tear down? How do we think about the things that deacons may be called to do at Union Church?
Well, I think primarily we'll talk about it in terms of care for the poor and vulnerable. This is where you kind of begin to see the distinction between if a deacon is just a generic servant and it can be a male or a female, they can kind of take on any role that the pastor doesn't do. Mm-hmm. They become alternative staff. So you have deacons of coffee on a Sunday morning and deacons of running sound and deacons of X, Y, or Z, everything that a church might need outside of preaching and praying on a Sunday morning. But we would see a more narrow application to really be focusing on how you preached about deacons in the first sermon on deacons, which was removing physical obstacles to joyful worship. And in that definition, I suppose you could talk about setup or something like that. You could fold a few things in there, but we're primarily thinking about benevolence, and member care for physical needs. What else would you say?
Yeah, I think we would just want to make clear what's the bullseye. So like, I think even you mentioning there, it's not that things outside of mercy ministry would be off limits to deacons. And certainly, again, thinking back to Acts 6 and the particular dichotomy of the pastors and elders needing the space to preach and pray, whereas the deacons are given this serving tables versus serving the word, right? That dichotomy does, I think, give some allowance to utilize deacons to take care of the church's physical needs, not just an individual's physical needs, but the church's physical needs. Yeah. And you see this throughout church history as well. But the bullseye, the center point that we're aiming at with deacons is the mercy ministry. How do we remove physical, tangible barriers to worship in the lives of our congregation? Then you have worldly or physical needs of the church outside of that ministry. And then you might have somewhere on that bullseye target as well, the mercy ministry that exists outside of the congregation. Yeah. Where it's like, how do we remove barriers for worship for people who aren't yet worshiping? Yeah. And so those, I think all of those things would fit under the label of deacons. But the heart of the bullseye would be the mercy ministry. Yeah. And the only other thing that I would add there is that just say really clearly again, we envision these deacons as leading teams that do this, not just executing themselves, but empowering the congregation, and especially those within the congregation that have the desire and capacity to serve really explicitly and specifically in these areas. They're leading and empowering.
Yeah, but in the same way, so to go back to the example of Emma Baker leading Union Kids, she's doing real leadership, and in the kind of organizational structure of the church, you are the pastor who oversees family discipleship. Yep. So you are overseeing Emma as she oversees Union Kids. And in the same way, we might see a similar kind of structure. So when we say we envision deacons leading teams, we're not necessarily taking leadership away from lay people who might lead in various spheres. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, especially as those ministries get built up and grow. And we have more and more complex needs.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple just really quick bullets, Ethan. I think we've addressed most of this, but I want to make sure if anybody has these specific questions, they hear an explicit answer. First one, why all the formality? Why ordain these men at all? We've kind of touched on it, but like, why not just, why do we even need these sort of titles? It all just seems a little fuddy-duddy.
Well, I want to be a Bible person, and if that makes me look like a fuddy-duddy, fine. The Bible gives us these two roles, explicit qualifications for each one. So I think I want to be shaped by the scriptures.
How is a deacon different from just a really faithful volunteer? And we've basically
just going to cite you back to what I just said about responsibility. I think that's the main distinction. Who bears the responsibility before the Lord? Final responsibility.
And then last thing, could a deacon become an elder, or could an elder become a deacon? Within that Catholic Church, you do often see deacon as sort of just the pipeline to future priests. So how will we think about deacons and elders kind of coexisting in that way?
I think there's an uncareful stereotype that the deacons in churches are just the younger guys who eventually, when they're older, will become elders. It's not an uncareful stereotype because that shouldn't happen. Sometimes that does happen, but it's not explicitly. Deacons are not elders light or junior elders in any way, or elders in training. It's kind of a different set of skills. But we do see, like in Acts 6, and then it's chapter 7, or maybe it's the rest of Acts chapter 6. Stephen then goes on to like give a sermon before he's martyred. So there could be a world where a Stephen type of guy who's functioning great as a deacon eventually feels a calling into eldership. But it's not like climbing the ladder in the church government world.
One of our elders, Jeff, was a
previously served as a deacon at another church. Yeah,
and could totally see that scenario. But it's not intended to be a pathway.
Yeah, as we evaluate those who our congregation are nominating for deacons, we might say something like, well, that guy seems like an elder to me, but not a deacon. And we're not saying anything negative in that. We're just kind of diagnosing gifting and calling,
And going back to your sermon, one of the things you said really clearly was that God cares a lot more about our character than our gifting. And so even as we evaluate that gifting, if somebody has the godly character that would fit in a deacon or elder, it's very likely that depending on how the Lord is working in that person's life and preparing them, that they could fit either role. And it kind of depends on where the Lord is calling them and what the church needs in that particular moment.
Yeah.
All right, Ethan, this has been a marathon. But
pretty good. I thought we could have gone for like 3 hours. We're only at like an hour and 15, 20 minutes. So that's
not
good.
Bad. Is there anything else that you left unsaid that you want to make sure the people listening here today?
The thing that I'm leaving unsaid is that I need to go to the Secretary of State's office in a few minutes as we record this. So we need to be done.
Let's close the book then. Brothers and sisters who are joining us today, we're grateful that you have. And our goal here, as it is always, is to equip the people of Union Church for discipleship and mission. If you're a Christian listening in from another context, we're grateful you've joined us, and we pray that this conversation might help you to follow Jesus and engage in his mission wherever he has placed you. For those of you who are listening from Union Church in particular, I just want to really clearly invite, if you continue to have questions about how we think about all of this, we want to hear those questions. We want to work through those things. We want to hear from you. So please, you can talk to any of the elders. You could also just send an email to connect@unionchurchmi.com and include the word podcast or deacons in your subject line. Thank you all for listening. Lord willing, we will hear you, or you will hear us rather, soon on another episode of the Afterword podcast.
Da, 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 da. Hey everybody, this is Chris, and welcome to Adventures in Odyssey.
That started out as
I know it was Indiana Jones. Yeah. But